Hi, my name's Alexa Harmon, and I'm going to be discussing the issue of consumption today. I would like to start by defining a couple of terms. Consumption itself is the using up of a resource. Where it becomes a problem is when we start getting into overconsumption, which is the action or fact of consuming something to excess. Okay, now I'm going to walk through some of the main causes of consumption, and I'm going to break it down into corporate, state, and individual causes. I'm beginning with corporate causes because in doing my research, it's become clear that big corporations are one of the biggest, if not the biggest reason that we're struggling with overconsumption. Corporations are almost solely focused on creating profit. Unfortunately, they are just generally not too concerned about their effects on the earth or the people living on earth. They spend millions of dollars on marketing to convince us that money is happiness. As our book states, through advertising, marketing, and control of information, corporations are able to create desires, invent needs, and foster traditions that encourage unquestioned consumption. Although, since some consumers are starting to become better educated, more corporations are at least trying to appear to be green or eco-conscious brands as a way of marketing to them. Corporations are focused on consuming the absolute highest amount of natural resources because it allows them to create a ton of product and gain maximum profit. Technological development has also become an issue. We are now able to extract natural resources much more efficiently. And while this sounds like a good thing, it actually just means that we're depleting resources at an incredibly higher rate. These technological advances also make corporations encourage mining and deforestation because, again, the more resources, the more product, the more profit. New technology like robotic drills, for example, also allow us to extract resources from difficult places as the easy to reach resources are depleted. In the past, the hard to reach resources would have remained untouched as they would have been too hard to get to. Lastly, corporations cause problems by donating huge amounts of money to politicians. They do this to gain power over politicians so that they won't support any policy that threatens to place restrictions on their practices. The state causes of consumption can really be boiled down to their acceptance of corporate donations and their lack of engagement with the topic of environmental protections. Like I said on the last slide, corporations commonly make huge donations to politicians and political parties so that they can have some control over environmental regulations. Many lawmakers also fail to speak much about overconsumption, making it seem like it isn't an urgent problem. Here's a political cartoon that felt relevant. As you can see, our lovely free trade system is guzzling up the natural resources and cheap labor in order to create consumer junk that will quickly be thrown away, environmental destruction, and pollution. Lastly, we've got individual causes of consumption. I do want to make it clear that most of these causes stem from the corporate and state causes. Unfortunately, when we live in a capitalist society, there's just not a whole lot we can do to make a huge difference on an individual level. But first, we've got buying too many things. Our society teaches us that buying things buys happiness, so it's not terribly surprising that people in wealthy nations tend to buy more than they need and use up a lot more resources. Here in the United States, we use up so much energy alone that, as our textbook explains, we use the power of approximately 150 energy slaves. This means that if the power we use were supplied by human labor, it would require 150 people working 24/7 to provide it. When we buy a bunch of stuff we don't need, we are encouraging the overconsumption of natural resources, especially when we buy things like iPhones that are only meant to last a few years. These purchases contribute to the treadmill of production and cause an enormous amount of waste. It's also an issue when we throw away unused items or things that could be reused. A huge amount of the population also lacks general knowledge about where our items come from and the resources they require. If we were all educated about these things, it's likely we would see some sort of decline in overconsumption. Lastly, we have overpopulation. The more people we have on the earth, the more resources we require. However, I do want to note that I listed this one last for a reason. The nations that tend to have extreme overpopulation are generally not the ones that have a high level of resource use per person. So while reducing overpopulation would help, it is certainly not the end-all solution. Now we will look at some of the consequences of consumption. The first and most obvious consequence is resource depletion. This stems directly from overconsumption. When natural resources are being used at a rate higher than they can regenerate, like we are now, they will eventually run out. This will cause a devastating lack of resources like oil, gas, and water. It will also cause food insecurity, particularly in poor nations where they can't afford to either import resources or resist selling their own resources to wealthier nations. Next, we've got the inequality of resource distribution and availability. Like I mentioned in the last slide, wealthy nations will probably be good for a while. They're able to buy their resources from other nations. However, it'll become incredibly difficult for poor nations to afford them because they'll be competing with the wealthy nations. As the availability of resources declines, many people will be forced to leave their home in search of a more plentiful area. This inequality is only becoming greater over time as wealthy nations become wealthier and poor nations become poorer. Pollution. The practice of extracting resources causes pollution in the air, water, and soil. This pollution causes health issues in the workers doing the extracting and the people that live close to the extraction site. Like the inequality of resource distribution, this can also drive local populations away as their home becomes an unsafe environment for them. The last consequence I'd like to discuss is the destruction of land. Now, this is pretty straightforward. The more trees we cut down, the fewer forests we have. When we build pipelines, we've got to tear up the earth. And as we ruin their natural habitats, animals and plants will become extinct. To end on a slightly optimistic note, I do want to discuss some possible solutions. The big ones are up to the government and big corporations. We could enact government policies that limit consumption and the extraction of natural resources. We can ban corporate donations to politicians. We can educate the general population about environmental issues. And on an individual level, we can vote for politicians who are focused on protecting the environment. We can avoid plastic, reuse material goods, and reduce our waste. And lastly, here are my references. Thank you so much for watching.